Om Ganati Miranda Shangana Gana Salakya Chaksurun Militam Yena Tajmai Sri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobistam Stapitam Yena Bhutare Sayam Rupakara Mayam Darati Swaparantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Siyata Parakamram Sri Gurun Vaishnavam Sha Sri Rupam Shagutatam Sahagana Raganatam Vitam Stam Sajevam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Vishakhan Vitam Scha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pastaya Bhutare Srimadi Bhakti Vedanta Swami Tinamane Namaste Sarasati Devi Gauravani Pacharin Nirvashes Sunyavadi Paskata De Satarin Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Sari Gaur Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare Hare. Good morning, Joe. Good morning, Govinda Dev. Govinda Dev has a trial this morning, so I won't take up a lot of your time. Most of us, morning Jimmy, Minnesota. Most of us had a late night last night. Hare Krishna's Varsana, good morning. Hare Krishna's go to bed early. It's not unusual in Spanish Fork for my wife and I to hit the hay by 9 in the morning, but the one exception of that is the Janmashtami day. We stay up until midnight, mostly fasting, in order to observe the midnight appearance of the Lord 5,300 years ago from within the prison house of Kamsa. And so we had those celebrations in Salt Lake City. I came up from Spanish Fork to Salt Lake City. Good morning, Malini. Preeti. Came up from Salt Lake City, and we're just kind of doing an impromptu broadcast here from the office in the Salt Lake City Temple. And I think I violated one of the primal rules of broadcasting, which is not to have a light background. I'm sitting in front of a window here, which makes an interesting light effects. But Prabhupada, our spiritual master, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, appeared the day after the Krishna's appearance day. And so we have two holidays back to back. The Janmashtami celebration of Lord Krishna, and today is the observance of the the appearance day of Srila Prabhupada. I have some references that I downloaded from a book by Shruti Kirti called What is the Difficulty? Shruti Kirti was Prabhupada's personal servant for many years. But I thought that you all would probably rather just hear my own personal recollections of any time we spent with Prabhupada. So if I draw a blank at any point, I'll read from Shruti Kirti's book. Otherwise, I'll just try to go stream of consciousness regarding, good morning, Anjali, Hare Krishna, Wisdom Wednesday, Prabhupada's appearance day. Indeed, it's a holy day. None of us would be where we are. None of us would be who we are. None of us would be doing what we're doing were it not for the entrance of His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, into our lives. I first met a devotee in 1970 in downtown Sydney. His name was Upendra. It was rush hour. We were right in the main street, George Street. It was dark, getting evening. Businessmen were headed home. And I had a brief conversation with Upendra to the effect that God is seated within the heart of every living being. It's possible to realize Him by cleansing the heart through the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. And he challenged me on that occasion to chant 5 minutes a day for a week, and then come back to him and tell him that I wasn't more keen on becoming God conscious than I had at any time before in my life. My background was my parents went to church. They went to the local Episcopal church in Pennsylvania without fail every Sunday. They weren't fanatic Christians, but they were very consistent and steady and committed Christians. And as long as my brother and I lived under their roof, we were going to go to church with them. There wasn't an option of staying home on Sundays. And I heard a lot of sermons. I remember Harvey Price was our chaplain. He was our priest for a while, and then he went on to become the main chaplain at Harvard University. After I went away to boarding school on the high school level, it was also sort of a prep school for Ivy League colleges. We were on the circuit. Harvey Price would come from Harvard, give a Sunday talk, Reverend William Sloane Coffin, whom you know, Govinda, or you know of. I think you said you and his father, your father and him were good friends. He used to come, Princeton. And then even when I went to college, wasn't Ivy League, University of Virginia, there were services required. I lived in a religious community called Koinonia under the auspices of the Episcopal Church. In all of that, I never really had awakened in me a firm faith or trust in God. Nothing gelled it, nothing brought it together. So when I encountered Upendra downtown Sydney in 1970, I was probably the best thing you could say about me is I was undecided or I was an agnostic. And Upendra challenged me to chant 5 minutes a day and just see if that wouldn't yield up more keenness, more interest, more intensity in the religious area than anything else I'd done. And so I did. I got myself a set of beads and I chanted for 5 minutes a day. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. And here I am 50 years later still chanting. So if there's a takeaway from this to our audience, if you just happen to be a non-devotee or a non-chanter, you know very little about Bhakti or Prabhupada or Krishna consciousness, but you just happen to have been scrolling across your Facebook page and come upon this, my word to you is, do the same thing. It's not much of an investment. What is it, 7 days, 5 minutes? That's 35 minutes. And based on that 35 minutes and what you find out about yourself and your dormant love of God, it could change your whole life. I love my life now. There isn't any aspect about my life that I'm not totally enamored with. I think it's as great a life as I could have possibly ever had. And in many ways, I'm living far above and beyond any of my wildest expectations. And it all started with the seed of chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare. Good morning, Terry. Krishna promises, Tesham Satati Yuktanam Vajanam Priti. If someone begins the process, if someone puts something in my hand, and it can be as simple and as easy an offering as simply 5 minutes a day for a week, Krishna says, I will take what they put in my hand and I will multiply it. This was what Prabhupada unleashed on the Western world. And this is what Upendra unlocked in me 50 years ago. I'm still chanting, still moving forward in devotional service, not at the level where I'm 24 hours engaged, absorbed, serving the Lord, but we're up there after all these years. Oh, it was inevitable then that I become more involved in the temple. And because I was one of the first persons to get involved in the temple and move into the temple along with Vaibhavi, ended up being some sort of a leader down there in Australia. And then Prabhupada wanted to visit Australia. And the first time Prabhupada came to Australia was in 1971, I believe, spring of 1971. And I was in charge there in the temple in Paddington. He stayed for about 4 to 5 days, and as the in-charge, later on Madhavisa came, Mohananda came, there were other people that kind of eclipsed me as a leader. I became like a second in charge, or a lieutenant colonel, you might say, but at this point I was the general, so to speak, in Australia. And I spent a lot of time with him those 4 days. I had arranged some speaking engagements and also some media engagements, some engagements where members of the press would come and interview him. And then also when nothing was going on, when he wasn't speaking to a crowd, when he wasn't interviewing or receiving somebody, I would be just there in the room with him. And what struck me was that he was a living, walking, talking scriptures. I was an English major in college and read a lot of novels, a lot of books of fiction by great authors. But there was always a difference between the author and the book. The author had his life, he had his kids, he had 3 cats, he lives in Long Island, he likes to jog, maybe he had a background in intelligence or journalism, whatever it was. But there was the author, his story, and then there was a story that he'd made up in the book, and there was a dichotomy between the two. What I noticed after being with Prabhupada for most of those initial 4 days was that there was no difference between Prabhupada and his books. His books were reflections of the Vedic scriptures, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, Chaitanya Charitamrita, Upadeshamrita. And whether he was speaking as a public persona or whether he was just kicked back with 1 or 2 people in the room, there was no difference. He was a living, walking, talking scriptures. And when you were in the presence of Prabhupada, you couldn't help but be God conscious. Ihayasya hare dasha manasa kamanaga nikadash vivasato jivan mukta sadicate. Jivan mukta sadicate. How do you know who's a liberated soul? You know who's a liberated soul because ihayasya hare dasha manasa kamanagira. Your mind, your works, and your deeds, every aspect of you, every level, every category of you, intellectual, spiritual, physical, sensual, is hooked up, is engaged unflinchingly and undeviatingly in the service of the Lord. And that was Prabhupada. We've been fortunate to live in Mormon, Utah for the last 35 years. And we meet a lot of good people, you know, the stake presidents, the bishops. They do their work on behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints without salary. There's hardly anybody salaried in the whole Mormon church, just essential office workers. And some of the retired men who act as apostles get a comped an apartment and a living wage, but everything's going basically on the basis of volunteerism. Some of the people that are leaders locally are called bishops and stake presidents. I've gotten to know several of them. I am full of admiration for them. They are people who are inspired to know God and to be better in their lives. But, you know, they go to the movies on Saturday night. They read the latest best-selling novels. A big part of them is entrenched in the mundane. And that wasn't Prabhupada. Prabhupada wasn't just like a good leader, like a stake president, like a bishop. He was not even like an apostle. He was one of those rare souls who is completely dedicated to the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So for us, he's right up there with Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and all of the messiahs who came down to reveal the spiritual world. So how do you know a liberated soul? Very simple. He's all about Krishna. You can't be in his association, or you can't read his books, you can't listen to his tapes, you can't visit his temples, you can't have a friendship or an acquaintance with any of his disciples and not become Krishna conscious yourself. You know, that 2-minute conversation I had with Upendra, one of Prabhupada's disciples from San Francisco, set me on the course that brings me before you here, broadcasting on Facebook Live the day after Janmashtami in 2020. Prabhupada initiated almost 5,000 disciples, and some of his disciples, like Jayapataka Maharaj and Radhanath Swami, they have more than 20,000 disciples themselves. So, just like honey, spiritual life is sometimes compared to honey, that when you knock over a jar of honey, what it does is it slowly spreads over the surface of the desk or the table that you upended it on. So the nature of genuine spiritual life is that it goes from one person to another person to another person. Right now, they say that a person infected with a pandemic who doesn't wear a mask or doesn't practice social distancing is likely to affect, by statistical analysis, 3 to 4 other people. And then, of course, each one of those 3 to 4 other people can affect 3 to 4 other people. So it quickly explodes. It quickly gets exponential. Krishna consciousness or genuine spirituality acts in the same way. One person can affect 3 to 4 people, and those 3 to 4 people can affect 3 or other 4 people. It's interesting that during the pandemic, there's such a presence of Krishna devotees online. Wherever you go, you scroll, it's just, I mean, of course, the internet knows how to, find out your preferences and track you and all. But even having said that, I think there's more to it than just me being tracked. The fact that I see devotees everywhere, Madhavananda, Chaitanya Charan, Gauranga, this new podcast by Raghunath and Kastuba It's called Wisdom of the Sages, has thousands and thousands of listeners. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've had young men come into the temple here in Salt Lake City, and I said, well, what brings you to the temple? And they said, I'm interested in bhakti. I never, in all my years, I never had a young person, 20, 22 years, walk through the doors of the temple and straight out come out and say, my priority in life is to deepen my bhakti. I said, well, where are you getting that from? They say, well, I listened to Wisdom of the Sages by Raghunath and Kastuba. So there's a thought for you, something you might want to check out. It's spreading. There are 700 to 800 Krishna temples all over the world. So Prabhupada came to Australia and he spent only 4 days. I remember we were sitting in the room one time and Prabhupada said, he was talking about the Yadu dynasties, and he said Yehudit. I had spent a year in Israel, and so my ears perked up. He said Yadu dynasties, because the Jewish people are highly intelligent, and they always felt themselves as being the chosen people. And the Hebrew word for Jewish is Yehudit, which you can't help but notice that's very similar to Yadu. And so Prabhupada just said something. It was just a snippet of a conversation when only I was in the room, but something, an indication that the Jewish people might have been the family members of Krishna back in the ancient times, and then, of course, emigrated from India into the Middle East and Palestine and Israel, and of course the history takes off from there. But at the time I thought, Yehudit, Yadu makes a lot of sense. Prabhupada came to Australia 3 times while I was there, and I also met him in India. It was mandatory that leaders would go to the annual Gaur Purnima festival in March, and there was an interesting couplet, you might say. A couple of times I went on the morning walks with Prabhupada. One morning, we would go to Mayapur in West Bengal, spend a couple of weeks there for the appearance day of Lord Chaitanya, and then we'd go to Vrindavan to celebrate Ram Navami, which usually occurs in the beginning of April. So on one morning walk in Mayapur, a devotee told him that 2 of his female disciples, I think Yamuna and Shasti perhaps, were living in the West Coast, and they were observing Ekadasi every day. They weren't eating grains at all. They had eliminated grains from their diet. They were only eating fruits and vegetables. And Prabhupada said, that is very good. Only animals eat grains. That was his response to the information. The 2 of your female disciples are living a life of hermits on the West Coast, perhaps it was Oregon, and they don't eat grains. They observe Ekadasi, which is a day when we don't eat grains, but they do it every day. And they've been doing it for a year. Prabhupada said, that is very good. Animals eat grains. So the word went out, all over the movement. The Prabhupada said it was very good that they didn't eat grains. He said animals eat grains. So all over the movement, devotees stopped eating grains because of what Prabhupada had said passingly in this morning walk in Mayapur. And of course, when you don't eat grains, you can get a little weak. And there was a vigorous book distribution emphasis in those days. Very few devotees stayed back at the temple in those days. They would go out and spend long hours on the streets distributing books, which took a lot of energy. They were out there in the elements and the heat and the cold and dealing with people and mustering up the energy to approach people, one after another, after another, after another. And so there started to be a general decline in the overall corporate energy, you might say, of ISKCON worldwide. So fast forward a couple of weeks later, and we're on another morning walk in Vrindavan, and someone mentioned to Prabhupada that many devotees throughout the movement have given up eating grains. And this was a devotee who was concerned about the book distribution results. And so he wanted to know what Prabhupada thought, or whether Prabhupada thought that eliminating grains from their diets was contributing to a slight decline in book distribution. And he told Prabhupada, he said, many devotees have given up eating grains and they're observing Ekadasi. Prabhupada said, why are they doing that? And the devotee was kind of shocked. He said, well, a few weeks ago during a morning walk, you said that it was very good to give up grains and that only animals eat grains. And Prabhupada said, I eat grains. Am I an animal? So when word about that conversation got all over the world, then everybody resumed eating grains, got their strength back, and booked his swoosh and went back. But when Prabhupada had said animals eat grains, he wasn't being dismissive or condescending about eating grains. His point was that animals do hard work. Take an oxen, for instance. He pulls the plow. He tills the fields in the hot sun. He's on his feet for hours every day. He's carrying a huge burden of weight. And so he eats grains to keep his strength up. And so when Prabhupada said animals eat grains, it wasn't a put down at all. He was saying that this is what animals do in order to keep their strength up, and we should follow their cue and also eat grains if we want to go out and do a full day's service for the Lord Sri Krishna. And I also, when I came back to America, I spent 5 years in Australia between 1970 and 1975. When I met Apendra, he had just arrived a few weeks earlier, and so Krishna consciousness was extremely infantile, I might say, in Australia. It was in its formative stages. And I didn't feel right about leaving. Even though I was only in Australia on a 1-month tourist visa, I ended up staying for 5 years, getting the visa extended and extended. Ironically, a week before I left and came back to America in 1975, I got a call to be interviewed by immigration. I went into my dhoti with my tilak on. And I don't think the immigration official exactly knew what to make of me, but anyway, he had a speech prepared, and he said, "Thank you very much. I've called you here to congratulate you that after 5 years in Australia and multiple extensions of your visas and all, and at one point, in order to get an extension, I had to apply for permanent residency. Otherwise, I had to leave the country. And so he told me that congratulations, you've been awarded permanent residency in Australia." And then he went on to tell me about all the economic opportunities that are available, about the jobs, about the mean average income, and so on and so forth. And I was leaving within a week. But anyway, I got permanent residency in Australia. But when I came back to America, I met Prabhupada on several occasions. One particular time was in Berkeley. Prabhupada was sitting on the Vyasasan in the newly acquired Berkeley Temple, which used to be a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there was a reporter there who asked him this question: what will happen to your movement after you die? And Prabhupada intuited the question, and before the sentence was finished, before he completed all of that, before all of that came out of his mouth, pretty much when the reporter said, what will happen? As the reporter was saying, after you die, Prabhupada jumped in and spoke over with a higher volume. He spoke over him and he said, "I will never die." The reporter was like shocked. The devotees were shocked. Prabhupada said, "I will never die." There was this long, pregnant pause. And then he said, "I will live forever within my books." And Prabhupada, the Guru, the self-realized soul, your savior, he appears in two forms. He appears in Bani and Bapu. He appears in his physical form, but Prabhupada was already 70 years old when he arrived on the shores of America. He was at the end of his life. 12 years later, he passed away. And we didn't have his, for the last 72, for the last 50 years, we haven't had the bliss of his physical association, and yet the International Society for Krishna Consciousness has grown by leaps and bounds. Disciples are being made, festivals, temples being established. It's growing like wildfire because the written word and the spoken word of the spiritual master are the same. You become Krishna conscious both in the physical presence of the spiritual master, but also by hearing his words. And when you read his books, you're also hearing in your inner ear. You're reading, but you're also listening to what Prabhupada has said about you. As you listen, as you hear, your heart becomes cleansed. And as your heart becomes cleansed, You come to know yourself as an eternal spirit, soul, part and parcel of Krishna. And then the more that you make advancement through hearing, then the more the dirty things from within the heart become cleared, and the more you're green-lighted to serve the Lord. Srinvatam Shrakata Krishnam Punya Sravanam. Just the process of hearing and chanting, and in of itself, is sufficient to make of you a pious, righteous, upright, living being. That word upright is interesting because those who are upright, they look up to God, and those who are not upright, they look down to their problems. Upright persons look to God. There is no problem that faces us, no pandemic, no legal complication, no health challenge, no financial difficulty, which is greater than God's ability to solve them. And so when we're in a tough time, when the darkness threatens, we resort to the inner knowledge that we're parts and parcels of Krishna, that he loves us, and he's always watching our backs. Sometimes people ask during these pandemics, well, when is God going to do something? He's doing something every day in your life. That accident you didn't get into, that sickness that you didn't get, that retort that you didn't say, you had enough astuteness, Krishna gave you this presence of mind to bite your tongue, that would have gotten you in a lot of trouble. We wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for the constant guidance and love of our Supreme Father, Lord Sri Krishna. You couldn't even get through a day of your life if he wasn't already directing you from within the heart. This world is so precarious. Samsrita ye para parvaparam mahad punyam punyo masa marari bhavam buddhir vatsa param 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 yabiparam teshaham. Every step in this material world is just full of danger. Someone said there are 52 million ways to die. Every one of us can think of a dramatic instance on the freeway or with a dangerous illness where we could have died, but Krishna pulled us through. Krishna wanted us to live another day because our mission on earth was not finished. He had more things for us to do. So if you're interested in long life for you and your children, get right in the middle of what Krishna wants to do in your life. Prabhupada didn't come to the shores of America until an age in which most people had given up, and most people sit in their easy boys with their big gulp and allow themselves to fall apart with high cholesterol and heart attacks. We have many senior citizen groups who tour the Spanish Fork Temple, and for those over 70, it's often hard to get up the stairs. They have numbness in their extremities due to diabetes, they have artificial hips, they have replaced knees, and Prabhupada struck out from India all by himself with no money and no connections at the age of 70 to spread Krishna consciousness. And so he wasn't destined to be with us for long. But Krishna gave him 12 years, which was all he needed to plant those seeds of Krishna consciousness all over the world. And I think I'll wind up our little gathering, our little meeting here this morning by describing how it was I was with Prabhupada on November 14th, 1977. I'll try and go through this quickly because it's hard to do it without getting choked up. It was obviously the worst day of my life. It was the worst day of all of his disciples' life. But it was also the beginning of our lives as spiritual leaders. You know, when the father passes away, he hopes that he's given his children all the tools to then carry on and become leaders and parents themselves. You know, the teacher teaches a student, and if the student learns well what the teacher has to impart, then the student becomes a teacher in the future, and that pleases the teacher. The teacher has made from the student another teacher. The parent has made from their child another parent, another guardian, another guide. And so Prabhupada was exemplary in the manner of his leaving his body. He stayed in Vrindavan, in the birthplace of Lord Krishna. He continued translating his books even up to the last. And I remember a message was sent out that all the leaders should come to visit Prabhupada because he's in the process of leaving us. And as the president of Berkeley, I booked a ticket accordingly to Delhi. When I was in Delhi, I had a lot of, one of the sub-purposes was to shop for the gift store. We had a very good, successful gift store there in the temple in Berkeley. And so I was faced with a choice upon touchdown in Delhi, whether I should get this gift store business behind me, get it taken care of so I wouldn't have it on my mind, and only after making the purchases and arranging for the shipping, which would take 2 or 3 days, then I would go to Vrindavan. Or I could go to Vrindavan right away. And I chose to go to Vrindavan right away because I didn't know how long Prabhupada would be with us. And that was a good choice because Prabhupada passed away the day after I arrived. I arrived in November 13th. And I remember being in the room with Prabhupada. He was being visited by some of his godbrothers. Ban Maharaj was there and 3 others. I believe Krishnadas Babaji was there also. And Prabhupada was in extremis, but they were having a conversation. And Prabhupada asked them to forgive him for his, what he called being temperamental. And they were just going like this. No, you don't. You took the banner, you took the baton of our common Guru Bhaktisiddhanta and you spread it to every town and village of the world. You don't, like, they were just shaking. They're old men, you know, but their heads were going. They were just, no, stop it. You know, don't go there. You don't have anything to apologize for. You've outdone all of us, you know. So that was the night before, just after I arrived, and went into the room with Prabhupada. And then the next day, the physician came in and examined him at 12:35, just after the noon hour. And this physician was amazing. He said he has 7 hours to live. He examined him, listened to his heartbeat, tested him. He said he has 7 hours. And in fact, he was right almost to the minute. Prabhupada passed away at 7:35 p.m. that same day. And when the Kavi gave this time frame, then of course devotees crowded into Prabhupada's room. It wasn't a big room, but it was packed, and chanting went on. I was fortunate because I had gotten a place. I was there when the doctor came, before everyone came in, and so I had a place right at the head of the bed, not 24 inches away from Prabhupada's head. And I had brought the pictures of Berkeley Temple, of which I was the president. It was called New Jagannath Puri. So I'd brought pictures of Jagannath, Subhadra, and Balaram and placed them right there by Prabhupada's head, and I also was there. And you know, before passing, before leaving this world, the senses generally shut down. Prior to leaving the body, the sight leaves one, hearing leaves one, smell leaves one, speech leaves one. So during those 7 hours, Prabhupada didn't speak. He would indicate sometimes that he would like to be turned slightly, or that he would like the light, very light cloth on or off. And we all took turns massaging his feet, and everybody was in a state of deep sadness. Kirtan was going on, and you know, a lot of tears were being shed. As 7:30 approached, you could see that Prabhupada was getting ready to leave his body, and I heard one devotee say that Prabhupada said Hare Krishna and left his body. I was 18 inches away, and I didn't. Of course, there was a lot of chanting and everything, and his mouth did move. What it was, his mouth was partially open, and someone, Bhakti True Swami or Tamal Krishna or Upendra, somebody put some water to moisten. Put some water, most likely sacred water. And at 7:35 or so, Prabhupada went. It was like he closed his lips to swallow, and then when he opened, it was evident to me that his soul had left the body at that point. So I didn't hear any audible chanting Hare Krishna. But what was obvious to me was that he was completely composed. He was not in any way panicked like an ordinary man would be at the prospect of his imminent departure. He was peaceful. He was totally prepared for making the transition. And you could tell that his inner life was 10% Krishna consciousness. You can't spend your whole life, 24 hours a day, thinking about Krishna, serving Krishna, writing books about Krishna, counseling disciples, traveling the world for Krishna, and not be Krishna conscious at the time of the death. In the Nectar Devotion, it says, is it possible for someone to be engaged in Krishna service fully and not be Krishna conscious? And the answer is no, it's not possible. It's impossible. So on that day, many years ago, our spiritual master left us physically, but behind, 50, 800-page books, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, teachings of Lord Chaitanya, Chaitanya Charitamrita. Prabhupada said, more books than you can properly study in a lifetime. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Daya Karya Vichara Vichara Keche Chite Papichamara Kara. Says, if you consider the philosophy that Lord Chaitanya and the Goswamis, Bhaktisiddhanta, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Narottam Das Thakur, the legacy they left us, the sheer volume of words permeated by the nectar of devotion, it's astounding. It's astounding. People think, uninformed people think of Vaishnava as a sentimentalist just chanting in the street. But there is an astounding, jaw-dropping, mind-numbing number of books which have been written and left to the world by those who follow the bhakti tradition. And those saints are present within those books. When you pick up any of those books, you're coming right into the room, so to speak, with that saint. And as you read and as you listen in your mind's eye, your heart is getting purified. You're becoming pious. You're becoming upright. Your dormant Krishna consciousness, which has lain within your heart since time immemorial, begins to awaken. And that Supreme Lord, who is your loving Father, your Creator, and who has a mission for you in this life, who wants to take you higher than you could ever have imagined possible, wants to fulfill dreams that you can't even believe, he begins to show up. He begins to awaken. He begins to wax his light from within the heart and dissipate the darkness of ignorance, lust, anger, and greed. So if you're a devotee and you've already been chanting, take this auspicious day. I'm sure you chanted a lot yesterday, but also today is another good day to chant and to think of how it is that we owe everything to our eternal spiritual master's divine grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna.